The thin, crinkled paper felt brittle and cold in Elena's hands. A final verdict delivered in a stark, red font: eviction notice. 2 days, 48 hours until the world she had desperately tried to hold together for her children would shatter completely. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A cold draft, smelling of damp concrete and city grime, snaked in through the poorly sealed window frame, raising goosebumps on her arms. She looked around the tiny apartment, every crack in the plaster, every stain on the worn linoleum a testament to a life lived on the very edge. The air was heavy with the scent of boiled potatoes, the only meal she could afford, and an undercurrent of her own quiet fear. A smell like burnt toast and unshed tears. Her stomach, empty for the last day and a half, twisted into a tight, painful knot. This wasn't just a home. It was the last bastion against the street, and the walls felt like they were closing in, squeezing the very breath from her lungs. The ticking of the cheap plastic clock on the wall wasn't just measuring time, it was a countdown to utter devastation. On the scratched surface of the kitchen table lay her entire world. €200, one crisp €100 note, and a sad collection of 20s, 10s and 5s, their edges softened by 1,000 anxious exchanges. Elena's calloused fingers, the fingers of a seamstress who hadn't sewn in months, traced the edges of the bills. It was a laughably small shield against the tidal wave of rent, bills, and hunger that was about to crash down on them. In the corner, shrouded in a dusty sheet like a corpse, sat her sewing machine, her prized possession. Now, it was just a dead weight of cold, silent metal. The main gear was stripped, a fatal injury she couldn't afford to fix. The smell of machine oil and dust rose from it, a phantom of her former life, of the hum and whir that meant income, stability, and pride. She felt a familiar nausea rise in her throat. Without that machine, she wasn't a seamstress. She was just a 42-year-old single mother with 2 children and no way to earn a living. The silence from that corner of the room was the most deafening sound of all. From the other room, she could hear the soft, even breathing of 9-year-old Sophia, a sound that both anchored and terrified her. Earlier, Sophia had asked why Mommy wasn't eating, and Elena had simply smiled, patting her own stomach and lying that she'd eaten earlier. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Then there was Leo. At 16, he was supposed to be a boy, but the stress had sharpened his face, making him look older, angrier. The school had called again. He was getting into fights. His grades were plummeting. She heard the faint creak of his bed, the muffled thump of a fist hitting a pillow. It was her fault. Her failure was a poison, and it was seeping into her children, twisting her son's hope into a brittle rage. She wrapped her arms around her own torso, feeling the sharp press of her ribs. The hunger was a physical pain, a constant, gnawing reminder that she was failing in the most fundamental way a mother could fail. Tears pricked her eyes. Hot and sharp, but she choked them back. She couldn't afford to break. The ghost of her husband, Marco, moved through the room in moments like these. She could almost smell the faint scent of sawdust that used to cling to his work clothes, almost feel the reassuring weight of his hand on her shoulder. He was the sturdy foundation of their lives, and his sudden death 5 years ago had left a crack that had finally splintered their entire existence. Now, there was only the cold, empty space beside her in bed and the relentless ticking of the clock. Each tick was an accusation. Tick, you didn't save enough. Tock, you didn't find a new job. Tick, you are alone. Tock, you will lose them. A wave of vertigo washed over her, the sheer weight of her powerlessness threatening to pull her under. An icy dread, colder than the draft from the window, crept up her spine and settled in her soul. It was the terrifying realization that she had no more ideas, no more fight left. She had run out of road. Elena sat in the oppressive darkness. The eviction notice, a ghostly white square on the table before her. A tombstone for her life in this apartment. The sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of a late-night bus, felt 1,000,000 miles away, accentuating her profound isolation. The only sound in her world was the low, struggling hum of the old refrigerator, a sound that mimicked the strained, desperate thrumming in her own chest. She was on the precipice of ruin, a single thought echoing in the hollow space where her hope used to be. What now? Her story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the deepest despair is the prelude to the most unbelievable discoveries. To follow Elena's harrowing journey and witness how she fights back from the absolute bottom, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. You will not want to miss a single moment of what happens next. The glow of her phone screen was a harsh, lonely light in the suffocating darkness of 2 a.m. Elena's eyes burned from lack of sleep, her thumb swiping numbly through endless, useless job listings. A wave of dizziness from hunger made the words blur. Then she saw it. A small, overlooked link, municipal auction, condemned properties. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She clicked. The page was stark, filled with properties nobody wanted. Her breath caught in her throat. Desperation, a sharp and metallic taste in her mouth, made her scroll faster. This wasn't a choice born of reason. It was the last, frantic grasping of a drowning woman. The scent of the cold, stale coffee in the mug beside her did nothing to clear her head, only adding to the sourness in her gut. She felt a tiny, dangerous flicker of something she hadn't felt in months, a desperate, irrational spark that her mind, starved for any solution, mistook for hope. She leaned closer, the screen illuminating the deep worry lines etched on her face. The list was a catalogue of urban decay, but one entry snagged her attention. Lot 7B, Warehouse, Industrial Zone. The photo was a single, grainy, black and white shot of a grim concrete box under a perpetually grey sky. The description was brutally clinical. Just a few sterile lines of text. Condemned structure, unsafe for occupation, sold as is. Then she saw the numbers that made her heart stop. Starting bid, 50 euro, 50 euros, a quarter of everything she had. Her mind, frantic and exhausted, started spinning a dangerous fantasy. A roof. It was a roof. It had walls. It was space. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a solid object in the world that could be theirs, a place from which no one could evict them. She could almost feel the solid concrete under her feet, a stark contrast to the shifting sands of her current life. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, momentarily silenced the gnawing dread in her stomach. It was an insane gamble, but the alternative, the street, was a certainty she could not face. Her gaze shifted from the glowing screen to the faint outline of her children's door. She could hear Sophia's soft, even breathing, a sound that was both her anchor and the source of her terror. She pictured Sophia's small hand in hers, sleeping on a cold park bench. She saw the rage and shame hardening Leo's face as they were forced out onto the pavement. The image was so vivid, so horrifying, that a wave of nausea rose in her throat. This warehouse wasn't a choice. It was the only shield she could possibly afford, however thin and rusted it might be. Her finger, trembling, hovered over the button. To place bid. With a choked sob, she pressed it. The confirmation screen appeared, and the 50 euros vanished from her mental ledger. The loss felt like a physical blow, a sudden, gaping hole in her chest. She had just thrown a quarter of their lifeline into the digital ether on a grainy photograph and a desperate prayer. The silence in the apartment suddenly felt heavier, charged with the monumental weight of her gamble. The email arrived at dawn, its notification chime slicing through the tense silence like a shard of glass. Elena's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. The subject line was stark. Auction result, Lot 7B. She held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She tapped it open. Congratulations. You are the winning bidder. The words seemed to float off the screen, surreal and unbelievable. A dizzying, disorienting wave of emotions washed over her, a terrifying elation mixed with profound dread. She had won. For 50 euros, she had secured a place, a tiny, fragile sense of control, a feeling she hadn't known in years, bloomed in her chest. For the first time since Marco's death, she hadn't just reacted to disaster. She had taken a wild, desperate swing at fate. A single tear, hot and sharp, finally broke free and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but one of raw, terrifying hope. She clutched the phone to her chest, its cold surface a strange comfort. The following day passed in a chaotic blur, a frantic race against the ticking clock of the eviction notice. The apartment became a whirlwind of motion. The sharp, screeching sound of tape being pulled from the roll was the soundtrack to their exodus, a sound that perfectly mirrored the fraying of Elena's nerves. She packed their few, meager belongings into crumbling cardboard boxes and thin plastic bags. Every folded shirt, every worn-out toy was a ghost of a life that was now over. She forced a bright, brittle smile for Sophia, telling her they were going on a grand adventure to a new, big place. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Leo, his face a thunderous mask of teenage resentment, helped in stony silence. His movements were jerky, efficient, and filled with a quiet rage that felt like a physical presence in the room. He didn't believe in adventures anymore. Her failure had burned that belief right out of him, leaving only cold, hard cynicism in its place. The journey was an odyssey into the city's forgotten underbelly. 2 bus transfers, each one taking them further from the familiar and deeper into a landscape of urban neglect. The air inside the buses was thick and stale, smelling of diesel fumes, damp wool, and the collective weariness of its passengers. Elena gripped Sophia's small hand, the sticky vinyl of the seat clinging to her worn trousers. Leo stared blankly out the grimy window, his reflection a pale, sullen ghost overlaid on the passing scenery of peeling billboards and graffiti-scarred walls. With each jarring stop, the vibrant life of the city receded. Apartment buildings gave way to low-slung industrial parks, which in turn gave way to endless stretches of chain-link fence and smokestacks that painted the overcast sky with thick plumes of grey smoke. Elena felt her stomach clench. This wasn't just a different part of the city, it felt like a different, harsher world entirely. When they stepped off the final bus, the environment assaulted them. The air was heavy and metallic, carrying a chemical bitterness that coated the back of her throat and made her eyes water. A constant, low-frequency hum, the song of a distant power substation, vibrated up from the cracked pavement and through the thin soles of her shoes, a relentless, unnerving thrum. There were no trees, no patches of grass, no bird song, only broken concrete, rampant weeds bursting through the cracks like ugly scars, and the cold, indifferent stare of shuttered industrial buildings. A sudden gust of wind whipped around a corner, carrying a fine grit that stung their faces and a mournful, whistling sound. Eleanor instinctively pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, a pathetic shield against the profound chill of the place. A knot of pure dread began to tighten in her gut. This place didn't just feel empty, it felt hostile, forgotten by everything good in the world. They walked for what felt like an eternity, their makeshift luggage growing heavier with each step. The straps of the bags dug painfully into Elena's shoulders, and a dull ache spread across her back. Sophia, her little legs exhausted, began to whimper, asking how much further it was. "Not long now, my love," Elena lied, her voice strained. And then she saw it. At the dead end of a deserted road, it loomed. The warehouse. It was exactly like the grim photo, yet infinitely worse. It was a colossal, brutalist block of stained concrete and weeping rust, a monument to decay. A high chain-link fence, crowned with sagging coils of razor wire, surrounded the property. A section of the fence was torn and bent wide open, a gaping metallic wound. The silence was absolute, not peaceful but dead, punctuated only by the plastic bags that skittered across the asphalt like desiccated ghosts. Her hope, already fragile, began to crumble into dust. This was a place where things came to die. As they drew closer, the full, devastating scope of the ruin became clear. The word derelict was an insult to the sheer decrepitude of the structure. This wasn't a building in need of repair. It was a skeleton. The vast, corrugated metal roof was a lacework of gaping holes and rust, staring up at the grey sky like the vacant eye sockets of a skull. Large sheets of metal siding hung precariously loose, groaning and creaking in the wind, playing a discordant, screeching symphony of terminal decay. The main roll-up door was a solid wall of rust, but a smaller man door to the side hung ajar on a single, tortured hinge. Elena stopped, her feet suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. The tiny, flickering flame of hope that had sustained her for 36 hours was instantly extinguished by a tidal wave of icy despair. Her throat went tight, and she felt as if she couldn't draw a full breath. The air itself seemed to reject her. With a trembling hand, she pushed on the groaning metal door. It swung inward with a protest of scraping metal, releasing a physical wave of air from within. The stench was an immediate, suffocating assault on her senses. It was a thick, complex miasma of rot, the smell of decades of dampness that had seeped into the very concrete, the musty odor of mildew, and the sharp, acrid smell of rat droppings and something vaguely chemical. It was the pure, concentrated smell of total abandonment. The interior was a vast, gloomy cavern. The only light came in weak, dusty shafts pouring through the holes in the roof, illuminating a galaxy of swirling dust motes, piles of rotting wooden pallets, rusted metal barrels, and mountains of unidentifiable junk created a treacherous, shadowy landscape. A deep, profound shiver, originating in the base of her spine, racked Elena's body. This wasn't a shelter. It was a trap. The floor was a broken, treacherous surface. The concrete was fractured and uneven, rising and falling in waves like a frozen, filthy sea. A thin film of grime and moisture made it slick and dangerous underfoot. In one far corner, a large, dark puddle of stagnant, oily water reflected the grey light from above, its surface shimmering with a chemical rainbow. Elena's mind reeled as she pictured trying to find a clean, dry spot on this floor to lay down blankets for her children. The thought was so monstrous it made her stomach churn with bile. There was no light switch, no water tap, not even a single pane of unbroken glass. It was a cold, damp, metal and concrete cage, completely exposed to the wind and rain. The cavernous silence was broken only by the steady, maddening drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling and the faint, panicked skittering of unseen creatures moving in the deepest shadows. Sophia, who had been silent with shock, finally broke. She buried her face into Elena's leg, her small body trembling. "Mommy, it smells bad," she whimpered, her voice muffled by the worn fabric of Elena's trousers. "I want to go home." The word home struck Elena like a physical blow, a sharp, cruel knife twisting in her gut. This was supposed to be their new home, this tomb. Then there was Leo. He dropped the heavy bag he was carrying. It landed with a loud, echoing thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ruin. He didn't shout, he didn't cry. He simply stood there, his face a frozen mask of disbelief that slowly, terrifyingly, melted into a look of pure, blazing fury. He turned his eyes on his mother, and in them she saw the accusation she was already screaming at herself. "This is your brilliant plan. This is the adventure you promised." The last vestiges of her maternal authority crumbled into shame. The last of Elena's manufactured strength evaporated, leaving her utterly hollow. Her knees felt watery, and she swayed on her feet, grabbing onto the rusted doorframe to keep from collapsing onto the filthy floor. She had gambled everything on a ghost of a chance and had lost in the most spectacular way imaginable. She had traded their tiny, flawed but warm apartment for this vast, uninhabitable sepulchre. She had spent a quarter of their survival money on a cage. The eviction notice had felt like a death sentence, but she realized now that she was wrong. This was so much worse. This was the grave itself. A tidal wave of failure, so total and absolute, washed over her, and she felt like she was drowning in the thick, foul air. The damp chill of the concrete floor seemed to seep up through the soles of her shoes, freezing her from the inside out. She was utterly, completely defeated. She forced herself to look out through the broken doorway, searching for any sign of life, any sliver of hope. There was none. The industrial landscape stretched out in every direction, a desolate panorama of grey on grey. Other decaying factories, empty lots choked with weeds, and a horizon smudged with pollution. The low, incessant hum of the distant power station was the only sound, a mechanical heartbeat for a dead world. They were completely and utterly alone. If they screamed for help, no one would hear them. If Sophia got sick, There was nowhere to go. The isolation was a physical pressure, a heavy weight crushing her chest. Her disastrous gamble hadn't just cost them money, it had severed their last tie to the world, to any semblance of community, safety, or help. She hadn't just failed them. She had actively led her children into a barren wilderness with no way back. A single, cold tear finally escaped and traced a slow path through the grime that had collected on Elena's cheek. It wasn't the start of a storm of weeping. It was a quiet, final admission of utter defeat. The manic hope of the previous night now seemed like a cruel delusion, a brief, hysterical fantasy before the final plunge. She had thought she had hit rock bottom when she read the eviction notice, but she understood the true meaning of the phrase now. The bottom wasn't a tiny apartment with no money. The bottom was this: standing in a cold, stinking, structurally unsound building, with her two terrified children, with €150 in her pocket, and with the crushing, absolute certainty that there was no way out. The knot in her stomach was no longer just hunger. It was the cold, heavy stone of irreversible ruin, a finality that promised nothing but more darkness to come. The first hour in the warehouse was an exercise in swallowing despair. Eleanor's every breath drew in the thick, foul air of decay, a constant reminder of her catastrophic failure. The damp cold of the concrete floor seeped through the thin soles of her shoes, a relentless chill that felt like it was creeping directly into her bones. She had to make a space, a corner of this tomb that they could call their own for the night. She looked for the driest, cleanest spot. An almost impossible task on the fractured, grimy sea of the floor. Sophia, her face pale with fear, clung to Eleanor's coat, shivering uncontrollably, her small whimpers lost in the vast, echoing emptiness. Eleanor felt her heart constrict with a pain so sharp it was physical. She had led them here, she had brought her children to this cold, forgotten hell, and the guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest and making it hard to breathe. The faint, dusty shafts of light from the ceiling were like spotlights on their misery, illuminating their utter desolation. Elena's voice was brittle when she spoke, an unnatural sound in the profound silence. "Leo, please, help me clear these crates. We need to make a space to sleep." Her son, who had been standing rigid with fury, didn't answer. He turned his head slowly, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, undiluted contempt. The last fragile thread of respect he had for her had snapped. He saw the piles of rotting wooden crates, not as a task, but as an enemy, a physical manifestation of his mother's disastrous decision. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were white. The scent of rust and old, damp wood filled the air around the towering, unstable stacks. To Elena, they were just more junk to be dealt with. To Leo, they were something he could fight, something he could break. A low growl of pure adolescent rage rumbled in his chest. Without a word, he stomped towards the nearest, tallest stack, his movements jerky and violent. He wasn't helping, he was venting. He didn't try to move the crates one by one. His frustration was a wild animal that needed release. He placed his hands on the teetering tower of rotten wood and shoved with all his might. The initial movement was a groan of protest. The shriek of old nails pulling loose. Dust, thick and chokingly dry, exploded from between the slats. The tower swayed for a terrifying second, a wooden leviathan hesitating before its fall. Then, with a deafening, splintering roar, it came crashing down. The sound was cataclysmic in the cavernous warehouse, a rolling thunder of smashing wood that echoed off the high metal ceiling and seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Crate after crate slammed into the floor, bursting apart, spilling their contents of rusted, unidentifiable machine parts. The noise was a physical assault, a pure expression of the rage and despair that had brought them to this place, a final, violent scream into the uncaring void. The chaos of the crash subsided, replaced by a ringing in Elena's ears and the soft patter of falling debris. A thick cloud of dust, ancient and acrid, hung in the air, catching the weak light in a dense, swirling fog. Her first reaction was a flash of anger at Leo for his recklessness. But as the dust began to settle, she saw that one particularly heavy crate, filled with solid metal gears, had been thrown against a section of the interior wall. It hadn't hit the raw concrete that made up most of the structure. It had impacted a large, flat panel that looked like it had been added later. The impact hadn't just dented it, it had created a massive, spiderwebbing crack. The sound had been different from the others, not a solid thud, but a hollow, resonant crack, like punching through a sheet of ice. A fine white powder, plaster dust, continued to drift from the wound in the wall, coating the floor in a pale, ghostly film. Her anger evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp curiosity. Leo coughed, waving the dust from his face. His rage was spent, leaving him breathing heavily, but his eyes were fixed on the wall. As the air cleared, the damage became starkly visible. The crack was at least a meter wide, a chaotic web of fractures radiating from a central point of impact. It was a clear, violent break in the uniformity of the grim interior. But it was what he felt next that made the breath catch in his throat. He took a hesitant step closer and felt it on his cheek. A draft. It was a faint but distinct current of cool, steady air, and it was flowing out of the wall. This wasn't the gusting, damp wind that whistled through the holes in the roof. This air was different. It was dry still, and carried a scent he couldn't place, something like old books and deep cellars. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier anger and filled with a strange new tone of wonder. "Mom, come feel this." At first, Elena wanted to ignore him, to retreat back into the numb shell of her despair. The last thing she had energy for was investigating a broken wall, but the change in Leo's voice, the sudden absence of animosity, was too strange to dismiss. She walked over, her joints aching, and knelt beside her son. He pointed to the largest fissure in the plaster. "Here," he whispered. She cautiously reached out a hand, her fingers tracing the sharp, broken edges of the plasterboard, and then she felt it. A cold, steady stream of air, like a breath being exhaled from the building itself. A shiver, completely unrelated to the warehouse's damp chill, traced its way up her spine. The air felt ancient, sterile, and untouched. It carried no scent of rain or rust or rot. It smelled only of time and darkness, a pocket of stillness preserved for decades. Her heart, which had been a slow, heavy drum of misery, gave a sudden, sharp thump of intrigue. "It's hollow," Leo stated, his voice barely audible. He balled his fist and gently tapped the wall next to the crack. The sound was a deep, resonant thump-thump, confirming his suspicion. Elena did the same, then tapped the solid concrete a meter away. The contrast was undeniable. The concrete produced a high-pitched, dead tink of solid mass, while the plasterboard panel sounded like a drum. There was a space behind it, a significant, empty space. Why would anyone build a hollow wall inside a warehouse? The question hung in the dusty air, a spark of mystery in the suffocating gloom. For the first time since they had arrived, a feeling other than sheer terror or soul-crushing failure began to stir within Elena. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something far more primal and compelling, a desperate, burning need to know what lay on the other side of that flimsy barrier. This wasn't just a random feature of the ruin. It felt deliberate. It felt hidden. The decision was unspoken, a silent agreement that passed between mother and son. In this place of total powerlessness, they had stumbled upon a single thing they could act upon. A secret. Leo's eyes scanned the debris-strewn floor, and he quickly found what he was looking for. A long, heavy piece of steel rebar, bent at one end, caked in rust, but undeniably solid. He hefted it in his hands. It felt like a weapon, a key, a tool of discovery. He looked at Elena, a question in his eyes. For a moment, she hesitated. The sound of breaking through the wall would be loud, violent. It felt like a transgression, but what did they have to lose? They were already in the deepest pit of despair. A wave of reckless resolve washed over her, extinguishing the last of her caution. She gave a single, firm nod. The small, shared act of defiance was a flicker of warmth in the oppressive cold, a bond reforged in the face of the unknown. Leo jammed the pointed end of the rebar into the largest crack and pulled. The sound of tearing plaster and splintering wood was shockingly loud, a violent ripping noise that echoed through the cavernous space. White dust exploded outwards, coating their faces and clothes. Sophia, startled by the noise, let out a small cry of fear. Elena rushed to her side, pulling her back and murmuring reassurances, her own heart hammering against her ribs. Leo worked with a feverish intensity, no longer driven by anger, but by a frantic, focused curiosity. He tore away large chunks of the plasterboard, revealing a dark, dusty void behind it. They worked together then, pulling and tearing at the crumbling barrier, their hands quickly becoming raw and covered in white powder. Each piece they removed widened the opening, revealing more of the deep, waiting darkness on the other side. It was hard, messy work, but it felt purposeful, alive. After a few minutes of frantic effort, they had created an opening large enough to see through, and they stopped cold. Behind the flimsy plasterboard wall was not the expected concrete of the warehouse's exterior. It was something else entirely. A solid wall of dark, riveted steel, slick with condensation. Set into the middle of it was a door, just as heavy and metallic, with no handle, no knob, and no lock visible on their side. It was perfectly flush with the wall, its seams almost invisible. It wasn't a door into the warehouse, it was the entrance to a room built within the warehouse. A hidden chamber, a concrete and steel bunker concealed behind a fake wall. A cold dread, mingled with undeniable excitement, washed over Eleanor. This was no storage closet. This was a secret, deliberately and carefully constructed. The cool draft they had felt was the air from this sealed room, a room that had likely not been opened in decades. The door was a formidable obstacle, a sheet of solid steel that seemed to mock their efforts. There were no hinges on their side, meaning it had to swing inward. Leo wedged the end of the rebar into the thin seam at the edge of the door, putting all of his 16-year-old strength into the effort. The bar bent under the strain, its rusted surface flaking off in his hands. The door didn't move. A feeling of crushing frustration began to build. To be so close, to have uncovered a secret of this magnitude only to be blocked by a locked door, felt like the cruelest joke of all. Eleanor ran her hands over the cold steel, searching for any weakness, any hidden latch or button. Nothing. It was a seamless, impenetrable barrier. She pressed her ear against the cold metal. Listening, she heard only silence. A profound and absolute stillness that felt heavier and older than the silence of the warehouse around them. It was the silence of a tomb. "Let me try," Elena said, her voice a low, determined whisper. She took the rebar from Leo. She wasn't stronger than him, but she had a different kind of focus. She examined the doorframe, her seamstress's eye for detail, searching for a weak point. She found it at the top corner, where the seal seemed slightly less perfect. She wedged the tip of the rebar into the tiny gap, and instead of pushing, she slammed her body weight down on the bar, using it as a lever. There was a high-pitched shriek of tortured metal, a sound that made her teeth ache. She did it again and again. On the fourth try, there was a loud, explosive pop that echoed like a gunshot. A locking bolt on the other side had given way. The top corner of the door moved inward by a single, crucial centimeter. A wave of incredibly stale, dry air, thick with the scent of old paper and dust, washed over their faces. It was the smell of a time capsule being broken open. With the lock broken, the door was no longer an immovable object. Working together, they managed to pry it open. It moved with a deep, groaning protest, its heavy steel scraping against the concrete floor. The opening was a rectangle of perfect, impenetrable blackness. It was a darkness so complete, it seemed to have a physical weight, a stark contrast to the gloomy twilight of the main warehouse. As the door swung fully inward, it revealed what lay within. It was a small, windowless room, a perfect concrete cube, no more than 3 meters on each side. The air inside was cold, dry, and utterly still. A simple wooden desk and a single chair sat against the far wall, both covered in a thick, uniform blanket of grey dust. And next to the desk, dominating the small space, stood a heavy, 4-drawer steel filing cabinet. It was a scene frozen in time, a secret office where someone had simply closed the door one day and never returned. The filing cabinet was the room's sole purpose. It stood there, squat and imposing, a silent sentinel guarding its contents. Its grey paint was peeling in places, but the steel beneath was solid, and the locks on each of the 4 drawers looked formidable. Elena felt a tremor of anticipation, a nervous energy that made her hands shake. This was it. Whatever secret this room held was locked inside that cabinet. She ran a finger through the thick dust on its top surface, leaving a clean streak. The dust was so fine and settled, it was clear no one had touched this object in a very, very long time. Sophia, who had been peering nervously from the doorway, pointed and whispered, "What is that, Mommy?" Elena didn't have an answer. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her gut, that the answer to that question was about to change their lives forever. The air felt charged, electric with the imminent possibility of discovery. Frustration flared again, hot and sharp. Every drawer was locked. Leo tugged on the handles, his knuckles straining, but they were immovable. The locks were sturdy. Professional-grade mechanisms, not simple latches. Eleanor frantically searched the desk, pulling open its single, sticking drawer. It was completely empty, save for a desiccated spider and a thick layer of dust. There was no key. The feeling of being thwarted, of standing on the very precipice of an answer only to be denied, was agonizing. "It's no use," Leo grunted, slumping against the wall in defeat. But Eleanor's desperation was a fire that refused to be extinguished. She looked at the rebar still clutched in her hand. It had opened the door. Maybe, just maybe, it could open the cabinet. A sense of wild, destructive resolve filled her. They hadn't come this far to be stopped by a set of simple locks. She would break it open. "Stand back," Elena commanded, her voice firm. She wedged the pointed end of the rebar into the seam above the top drawer, right where the lock mechanism was housed. She positioned herself, planting her feet wide on the dusty concrete floor. She took a deep breath, the stale air filling her lungs, and threw all of her weight, all of her desperation, all of her pent-up fear and anger into the lever. The rebar bit into the steel with a piercing shriek. The cabinet groaned, tilting precariously. "Hold it!" she yelled, and Leo rushed to brace the heavy cabinet, his feet sliding on the dusty floor. Eleanor pushed again, her muscles screaming in protest. The metal bent, the seam widening with a screech of pure agony. Then, with a final deafening crack that was both a breakage and a release, the locking mechanism snapped. The drawer popped open a few inches, the sound echoing like a starting pistol in the small, silent room. With her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Elena pulled the heavy drawer open. It slid out with a low, metallic rumble. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The sight was so surreal, so utterly unbelievable, that for a moment her mind refused to process it. The drawer was filled to the brim with transparent, vacuum-sealed plastic bags. And inside each bag, arranged in neat, tight bundles, was money. Stacks and stacks of it. It wasn't the familiar, crisp design of the euro. These were notes of a different era, vibrant with colors and foreign faces. A dizzying wave of vertigo washed over her, and she had to place a hand against the cabinet to steady herself. The sheer, dumbfounding reality of what she was looking at was too much to absorb. It was a treasure, a literal, buried treasure, hidden away from the world in a concrete tomb. The raw, undeniable proof of it lay before her, silent and overwhelming. Her trembling fingers reached in and lifted one of the plastic bags. It was surprisingly heavy, the plastic thick and smooth. The air had been sucked out, preserving the contents perfectly. Through the clear plastic, she could see the notes clearly. They were German Deutschmarks, the iconic portrait of Clara Schumann staring up at her. In another bag, she saw the delicate artistry of French francs, featuring Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and the Little Prince. This was old money, a pre-euro hoard from a time before the continent's currencies had unified. It was a ghost fortune, money that was no longer in circulation, but was still, she knew, exchangeable at national banks. It was value, frozen in time. A thought, wild and exhilarating, shot through her mind. This was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. It was a lifeline. It was a miracle. It was an escape. Leo let out a low whistle of disbelief. He reached past her and helped her pull open the second drawer. It was the same, and the third, and the fourth. Each drawer was a treasure chest, packed tight with vacuum-sealed bundles of old-world currency. The sheer volume was staggering. It wasn't just a few thousand, It was a fortune, a vast, hidden reservoir of wealth. They began pulling the bags out, stacking them on the dusty desk. The pile grew higher and higher, a surreal mountain of forgotten money. The plastic bags made a soft, crinkling sound as they handled them, the only noise in the room besides their own ragged breathing. Elena felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. Just hours ago, she had been counting the last of her 200 euros, and now she was standing in front of a hoard so large she couldn't even begin to guess its value. The absurdity, the sheer whiplash of fate, was almost too much to bear. As they emptied the final drawer, they found something else tucked away at the very bottom, hidden beneath the last layers of cash. It wasn't money. It was several large, thick books, bound in dark, cracked leather. Elena carefully lifted one out. It was heavy, substantial. The leather was cold and stiff to the touch, and it smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. There was no title on the cover, no markings of any kind. She set it on the desk, her hands shaking slightly, and opened it to a random page. The paper was thick and yellowed with age, and it was filled, from top to bottom, with columns of meticulous, spidery handwriting. There were names, dates, and long strings of numbers followed by currency symbols, DM for Deutschmarks, FF for French francs. Her heart began to beat faster, but this time it wasn't with excitement. A new feeling was creeping in, something colder and sharper, apprehension. This wasn't just a ledger, it felt like a record of secrets. Next to the ledgers, at the very back of the drawer, was a small, unassuming cardboard box, about the size of a shoebox. It was sealed with a single piece of yellowed, brittle tape. Elena's fingers fumbled as she peeled the tape away. It crumbled to dust under her touch. She lifted the lid. The box was filled with ordinary audio cassette tapes, dozens of them, nestled in neat rows. A faint, plasticky smell, the signature scent of the 1980s and 90s, rose from the box. There were no commercial labels, no album art. Each cassette had a simple, white adhesive label affixed to it, and on each label, written in the same spidery handwriting as the ledgers, was nothing more than a date. 14/10/1992, 03/11/1992, 18/12/1992. The dates spanned a period of about 3 years. Nothing else, no names, no subjects, just a cryptic, chronological list. The mystery of the room deepened exponentially. A profound chill settled over Elena, pushing aside the initial wave of elation from finding the money. The cash was a solution to her problems, a stunning, miraculous gift from fate. But the ledgers and the tapes felt different. They felt dangerous. The cold, hard data in the books and the silent, unlabeled recordings hinted at a story far more complex and sinister than a simple hidden fortune. Where had all this money come from? Whose names were written in these columns? And what was recorded on these tapes that someone felt the need to lock them away in a concrete bunker, hidden from the world? A shiver of pure dread ran down her spine. She realized with sickening certainty that they hadn't just stumbled upon a treasure. They had unearthed a secret, a dark and heavy story that had been deliberately buried. The money wasn't a gift. It was evidence. Leo, who had been staring at the mountain of cash with wide-eyed awe, seemed to sense the shift in his mother's mood. He picked up one of the ledgers, his fingers tracing the strange, spidery script. The initial, explosive joy on his face was slowly being replaced by a dawning understanding, a look of grim fascination. He was old enough to know that fortunes of this size, hidden away in a derelict warehouse with cryptic records, were never earned through honest means. He looked from the ledgers to the box of tapes, then to the pile of money. "Mom," he said, his voice a low murmur. "What is all this?" The anger he had felt earlier was a distant memory, burned away by the sheer magnitude of their discovery. In its place was a shared sense of trepidation, the unnerving feeling that they were standing in the middle of a story they were never meant to find. The warehouse was no longer just a ruin, a symbol of Elena's failure. It had transformed. It was now a crime scene, a mausoleum for a secret that had been dormant for 30 years. The cold they felt was no longer just the damp of the building. It was the icy chill of the unknown story that permeated the very walls of the hidden room. The air, thick with the smell of old paper and dust, felt heavy with unspoken words. with the ghosts of the people whose names filled the ledgers. Eleanor looked at the pile of money, then at the evidence of how it had been acquired. A terrible conflict began to brew inside her. On one hand, this was their salvation, a way out of poverty, a future for her children. On the other hand, it was tainted, a fortune born from a story that was clearly dark and perhaps violent. The silence of the bunker pressed in on them, no longer empty, but filled with questions. They had found an answer to their immediate prayers, a solution to the crushing weight of poverty that had been suffocating them. But in doing so, they had opened a Pandora's box. The discovery of the hollow wall had solved one mystery, only to present them with a new one, infinitely larger and more perilous. What was the story behind the money, the ledgers, and the tapes? Who was the person with the spidery handwriting who had amassed this fortune and then sealed it away? And most importantly, what would happen now that the secret was unearthed? A cold knot of fear tightened in Elena's stomach. She had a terrifying premonition that the person who had hidden this treasure would not be happy that it had been found. Their problems were far from over. In fact, she suspected they had only just begun. The first part of their journey was over. They had survived. But the next part had just been revealed, and it promised to be far more dangerous. The first purchase was an act of rebellion against the crushing weight of the secret. Using a handful of the dusty French francs, which she exchanged for a pittance at a skeptical currency office, Elena bought a second-hand cassette player. The trip into the city was a surreal experience. She walked among people, a ghost carrying an explosive secret. Her pockets were filled with more money than she'd ever held, yet she felt poorer than ever, burdened by a wealth that felt like it was radioactive. She found the player in a grimy pawn shop that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. It was a cheap, black plastic box with clunky silver buttons, a relic from another time. Holding it, she felt its flimsy weight in her hands, a stark contrast to the heavy leather of the ledgers. The purchase felt like a betrayal of her own safety, a deliberate step from the shadows of the unknown into the harsh light of a truth she was terrified to confront. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against the cage of her chest. This cheap machine was the key, and she both craved and dreaded the door it would unlock. Back in the suffocating stillness of the hidden room, the air felt colder, heavier. Leo stood beside her, his teenage bravado replaced by a grim, silent focus. Sophia was asleep in their makeshift corner, a small, innocent form oblivious to the darkness her mother was about to excavate. Elena's hands trembled as she picked up the first tape from the box. The white label was stark against the black plastic. 14/10/1992. The date meant nothing and everything. With a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed the cassette into the player. The plastic door clicked shut with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the profound silence. She pressed the play button. The internal motors whirred to life, a low, mechanical groan, and the cheap speaker emitted a long, drawn-out hiss of static. It was the sound of time itself, the sound of 30 years of silence being broken. She felt a wave of nausea, her stomach clenching into a tight, painful knot. She was no longer just an observer. By pressing that button, she had made herself a part of this story, a story she had a sinking feeling would consume them all. Then, a voice emerged from the hiss. It was a man's voice, surprisingly calm and articulate, with a smooth, almost gentle cadence. "Let's begin again," the voice said, the sound tinny and distant, but perfectly clear. "You understand that your situation is precarious. You are here, but on paper, you do not exist." A second voice replied, barely a whisper, the words thick with a heavy Slavic accent, trembling with exhaustion and fear. "I understand. Please. My wife. She is not well." Elena felt a jolt, a current of ice-cold dread that shot straight up her spine. The calm, rational tone of the first man was a horrifying counterpoint to the raw desperation of the second. This wasn't a business meeting. It was an interrogation. It was the sound of a predator toying with its prey. The sterile, dry air of the bunker suddenly felt thick, suffocating her with the ghosts of this long-forgotten conversation. She could almost smell the fear, a scent like cold sweat and rusted metal emanating from the cheap plastic speaker. Elena leaned closer, her ear pressed to the speaker, as if trying to absorb the truth through the vibrations. The smooth voice continued, its tone dripping with false empathy. Of course, her health, your children's future, this is all we care about. We provide a new life, a clean slate. But this service, this miracle, it is not free. There was a rustle of paper, a sound so crisp on the tape it made Elena flinch. The ledgers show you declared a value of 20,000 Deutschmarks when you crossed the border. A small fortune. We require a facilitation fee to ensure your paperwork is processed without complications. The desperate man's voice cracked. But that is everything. It is all we have in the world. Eleanor's own breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold. The word wasn't extortion, but the meaning was the same. She was listening to a man's soul being methodically and calmly stripped away, his entire life savings being stolen under the guise of salvation. The money in the drawers wasn't a fortune, it was a collection of stolen lives. She listened to another tape, and then another. The dates changed, the accents of the victims shifted, from Bosnian to Albanian to Kurdish. But the script was brutally, monstrously the same calm, predatory voice, the same desperate pleas, the same heartbreaking capitulation. One tape held the sound of a woman weeping quietly as the man explained that her passage to France would cost every franc her family had saved. Another recorded a young man begging, explaining the money was for his parents' medicine. The smooth voice was unmoved. Unfortunate, it said coolly, but a new future has its price. The ledgers, once just columns of numbers, now screamed with meaning. Each entry was a person, a family, a story of hope, systematically dismantled and converted into cash. The warehouse wasn't just a building, it was a processing center for human misery. This was where hope came to die, its last vestiges extorted and then locked away in a steel cabinet. A hot, acidic bile rose in Elena's throat. The treasure was a curse. The architect of this horror was a single man, the owner of that chillingly calm voice. The introduction of the euro, Elena realized, must have been his downfall. Suddenly, this hoard of Deutschmarks and francs became a liability, difficult to exchange in such quantities without raising questions. So he had simply sealed it away in its concrete tomb, hidden behind a false wall, a time capsule of pure evil, waiting. The knowledge settled in Elena's soul like a shard of ice. The man from the tapes was not a ghost from the past. A man that meticulous, that ruthless, would not simply vanish. He was out there somewhere. He was older now, but he was alive. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her, so powerful it made her legs feel weak. She was no longer just the discoverer of a secret. She was the keeper of evidence against a monster. And her fingerprints, her very presence, were now all over his buried history. The warehouse, which had felt like a cage, now felt like a tomb she had willingly entered. A few days crawled by in a state of suspended terror. The money, once a symbol of impossible hope, now lay in a pile of plastic-wrapped poison. Elena couldn't bring herself to touch it. Every time her gaze fell upon the stacks of old currency, she didn't see a future for her children. She saw the terrified faces of the refugees from the tapes. She heard the sound of their weeping. The warehouse became a haunted house, its groans and creaks the sighing of ghosts. The constant low hum of the distant power station now sounded like a mournful dirge. She felt trapped, paralyzed by a moral dilemma of impossible weight. To use the money would be to build her family's future on a foundation of stolen dreams. To report it would be to invite the attention of the man with the smooth voice, a man who was surely still powerful, still dangerous. She was caught between a cursed fortune and a terrifying truth. And either path felt like it led to ruin. The stress was a constant. Physical ache behind her eyes, a knot of dread that never loosened. Then, one gray afternoon, a sound broke the desolate monotony of the industrial zone. It was a sound so alien to this wasteland of decay that it felt like a gunshot. It was the low, guttural purr of a high-performance engine, the confident hum of expensive precision engineering. Elena's heart seized in her chest. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through her veins. She scrambled to a tear in the rusted metal siding, her hands shaking, and peered out. A car, a long, sleek Mercedes the color of polished jet, was gliding to a stop by the broken fence. It was a vehicle that belonged in a different universe, a world of manicured lawns and corporate towers, not this forgotten purgatory. A man in a dark, exquisitely tailored suit emerged. He was in his late 70s, with a mane of silver hair and a posture that radiated an aura of immense power and lifelong confidence. He moved not like a visitor, but like a king surveying his old, forgotten lands. Elena's blood turned to ice in her veins. The man was Mr. Valerio, a name she knew from the city's business pages. A celebrated real estate magnate, a renowned philanthropist whose name adorned hospital wings and university libraries. He was a pillar of the community, but as she watched him move, a horrifying certainty began to crystallize in her mind. He didn't wander. He didn't explore. He walked with an unnerving purpose, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel with a rhythm that echoed the methodical coldness of the voice on the tapes. He walked directly toward the main door of the warehouse. A memory, a single phrase from one of the tapes, flashed in her mind, the smooth voice saying, "My associates and I value discretion." Valerio, the philanthropist, the monster from the tapes, they were the same man. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The past was not buried. It had a name, a face, and it was standing right outside her door. He knocked. The sound was a polite, almost gentle rap of knuckles on the rusted metal, but in the echoing expanse of the warehouse, it sounded like a judge's gavel. Knock, knock. Elena froze, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, to hide. She looked at Leo, whose face had gone pale, his eyes wide with the same dawning terror. But where could they go? The back of the warehouse was a wall of debris. He knew the property was sold. He knew someone was inside. Hiding was not an option. With a heart that felt like a block of ice in her chest, she forced her trembling legs to move. She pulled the groaning door open just a few inches, squinting into the grey afternoon light. Mr. Valerio stood there, a warm, grandfatherly smile on his face. The smile was a perfect, practiced mask, but it did not reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, pale, and intensely sharp, like the eyes of a hawk, and they were scanning everything, taking in her worn clothes, the fear on her face, the darkness of the ruin behind her. "Good afternoon," he said. The voice was deeper, aged by 30 years, but it was utterly, terrifyingly unmistakable. It was the smooth, calm, predatory voice from the audio cassettes. A wave of vertigo washed over Elena. She gripped the edge of the door to keep from falling. His cologne, a rich and expensive scent of sandalwood, drifted into the warehouse, an obscene intrusion into the air thick with mold and rot. "I am Valerio," he announced, extending a hand that was smooth and adorned with a heavy gold ring. "A pleasure. I was just in the area and heard this old place finally found a new owner. I have a certain fondness for it. I owned this land a lifetime ago." His gaze drifted past her into the cavernous gloom, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a nostalgic smile. The casual words, "owned this land," hung in the air, a lie wrapped around a threat. He wasn't visiting a property, he was checking on a tomb. He was here to see if his secrets were still safe. He launched into a performance of feigned concern, his brow furrowed with practiced sympathy as he peered into the ruin. "My goodness," he tutted, his voice dripping with condescension. "You cannot possibly be living here. Not with children. The structure is unsound. The area is unsafe. It is a death trap, my dear woman." Every word was a carefully chosen barb, designed to intimidate her, to make her feel small and helpless. Then came the offer, delivered as if it were an act of profound charity. "Look, I am redeveloping this entire industrial park. This lot is a missing piece of my puzzle. I'll take this worthless burden off your hands. It's a ruin. But for you, let's say 5,000 euros, in cash. Right now, you can take your children and walk away from this nightmare today." 5,000 euros. The number was an insult, a joke. But it wasn't a real offer. It was a question. It was a baited hook, dangled to see if she would bite, to see if she had any idea of the real treasure that lay just meters away. Eleanor felt his cold eyes fixed on her, dissecting her reaction, searching for any sign that she knew more than she should. Her mind was a screaming vortex of terror. She had to say something, anything, but her throat was tight and dry. The words lodged like stones. The fortune in the other room could give her children a life he could never imagine, but the man offering her pennies for it was the devil himself. She forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to project an image of a simple, ignorant woman overwhelmed by her circumstances. She stammered, I don't know. I have to think about it." It was the wrong answer. The mask of the benevolent philanthropist disintegrated in an instant. The smile vanished, replaced by a chilling stillness. The warmth evaporated from his eyes, leaving only a flat, reptilian coldness. The air around them grew thick and heavy, charged with a palpable menace. The predator had been patient, but his patience was at an end. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost all its manufactured warmth. It was low, quiet, and sharp as a razor's edge. "Think carefully," he hissed, the words slicing through the air. He took a half-step closer, invading her space, his presence overwhelming. "This is not a good neighborhood. Vagrants, drug addicts. They shelter in these old buildings. They are animals, desperate." His gaze flickered deliberately past her, towards the deep shadows where he knew her children were hiding. The implication was as clear as if he had screamed it. "A single mother," he continued, his voice a venomous whisper, "with two beautiful, vulnerable children. You should be exceptionally careful out here. Accidents happen. Terrible accidents. In places like this, they happen all the time." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked, brutal promise hanging in the foul air between them. He had shown her his true face. He held her gaze for one terrifying moment longer, a silent assertion of his absolute power, then turned on his heel without another word. The crunch of his expensive shoes on the gravel was the only sound. He didn't look back. The low purr of the Mercedes engine starting up was a sound of finality, fading into the industrial hum and leaving behind a silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise. Elena was left trembling, her hand gripping the rusted door so tightly her knuckles were white. The cold dread that had been a knot in her stomach had now flooded her entire body, leaving her numb and shaking. The cursed money was no longer a moral problem. It was a death sentence. Valerio knew someone was in his warehouse, and he would stop at nothing to get his secret back. What would you do in her place? Would you accept the crushing weight of his threat and disappear, burying the truth to save your family? Or would you hold on to the evidence of his crimes, risking a war with a ruthless monster for a slim chance at justice? The silence Valerio left behind was a physical entity, a suffocating blanket woven from his threats and the cloying scent of his expensive cologne. It clung to the damp air, a violation more profound than the rot and rust. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her knuckles white where she gripped the cold metal. The purr of his engine had faded, but his words echoed in the vast, empty space, replaying in a hellish loop. "Accidents happen." The phrase was a venomous serpent, coiling around her heart and squeezing the air from her lungs. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her entire body, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. The world had shrunk to the size of this tomb, and the walls, which had once felt like a symbol of her failure, now felt like the jaws of a trap, slowly, inexorably closing. The knot in her stomach, once a dull ache of hunger and despair, was now a razor-sharp shard of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't just coming back for the money, he was coming back for her. Leo found her there, a statue of fear silhouetted against the grim grey light. He had heard the man's final words, the shift in tone from condescending charity to naked menace. He saw the abject terror on his mother's face, a look he hadn't seen even when the eviction notice arrived. The sight extinguished the last embers of his adolescent rage, replacing it with a cold, clear dread that mirrored her own. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. The single word broke the spell. Eleanor turned from the door, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if seeing ghosts in the dusty air. "He knows," she breathed, the words barely audible, a ragged exhalation of sound. "He knows we're here. He knows." She didn't have to explain who he was. The man's powerful presence had saturated the very atmosphere of the warehouse. The secret in the hidden room was no longer a potential salvation, it was a ticking bomb, and the man who had planted it had just returned to light the fuse. The game had changed, and they were no longer just players, they were pawns. The weight of the threat pressed down on them, a physical force that made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. The warehouse was no longer their desperate shelter, it was Valerio's territory, a hunting ground where they were the prey. Every creak of the rusting metal, every gust of wind whistling through the holes in the roof, sounded like his approaching footsteps. The vastness of the space, which had once felt so overwhelming, now offered no place to hide. Elena felt a primal instinct to flee, to grab her children and run until the chemical smell of the industrial zone was a distant memory. But where could they go? They had 150 euros and a secret that could get them killed. The city was a maze of dangers, but Valerio was a monster with a name and a face, a far greater threat than any random violence. They were trapped, caught between the crushing certainty of poverty and the lethal uncertainty of Valerio's next move. Fear was a poison, seeping into her veins, paralyzing her will, and clouding her thoughts. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange stains across the polluted sky, a new sound reached them. It was a hesitant, scraping noise coming from nearby. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat, thinking it was Valerio's return. She motioned for the children to be silent, her body tensed like a bowstring. But the sound was wrong. It was slow, shuffling, not the confident crunch of expensive shoes or the heavy tread of thugs. She crept back to the tear in the siding, her breath held tight in her chest. A figure was emerging from a ramshackle structure 100 meters away. A place she hadn't even registered as a dwelling. It was a shack cobbled together from scrap metal, old tires, and pieces of wood, a testament to survival against all odds. The figure was a man, old and stooped, his silhouette frail against the dying light. He moved with the cautious, painful deliberation of old age, his eyes fixed on the warehouse, on the spot where the Mercedes had been. He was coming toward them. His approach was agonizingly slow, a journey across the cracked asphalt that seemed to take an eternity. Elena watched, her fear warring with curiosity. He wasn't a threat. His body language screamed caution and trepidation. He was thin, almost skeletal, and wore layers of mismatched, stained clothing. A long, grey beard clung to a face that was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line telling a story of hardship. As he drew closer, she could smell him, a faint, not unpleasant odor of motor oil, wood smoke, and old wool. He stopped about 10 meters from the warehouse door, his pale blue eyes, watery with age, blinking nervously in the gloom. He clutched an old, battered cap in his gnarled, dirt-stained hands. He looked from Elena, who had cautiously stepped into the doorway, to the hulking mass of the warehouse, and a visible shudder ran through his frail frame. He opened his mouth, but at first no sound came out, only a dry, rasping breath. He looked like a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in years. "I saw the car," he finally rasped, his voice a dry whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "The black one, the big one. He came back." The man didn't need to say Valerio's name. The sheer terror in his voice was identification enough. Elena felt a strange kinship with this man, this ghost from the fringes of the city. He had seen it too. He knew. "Who are you?" Elena asked, her own voice barely above a whisper, unwilling to break the fragile tension of the moment. The old man took another hesitant step forward. "My name is Arthur," he said, his gaze never leaving the dark, menacing facade of the warehouse. "I am a neighbor. I live here. For 30 years, I have lived here, in the shadow of this place." His eyes, filled with a deep, ancient sorrow, met hers. "I hoped I would never see his car here again. I prayed I would die before I ever saw him again." A profound shiver racked his thin body, a testament to a fear that was 3 decades old, but as fresh as a new wound. Arthur lifted a trembling, bony finger and pointed at the warehouse. The gesture was filled with a mixture of revulsion and awe. "You do not know what this place is," he said, his voice gaining a slight strength, fueled by the need to bear witness. "You think it is a building, a ruin. It is not. It is a mouth. It is a grave. In my language, we had a name for it. We called it Poslednia Stanica. He paused, his watery eyes searching her face to see if she understood. It means the last stop. The name hung in the cold air between them, a chilling, perfect summation of everything Elena had come to fear about the building. It was a place of endings. The last stop for hope. The last stop for money. The last stop for people. Arthur's words were the final piece of the puzzle, the human context that the ledgers and tapes could only hint at. This wasn't just a financial crime, it was a history written in disappearances. Her blood ran cold as the full, horrifying picture finally snapped into focus in her mind. In the 90s, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes darting around as if Valerio's ghost might be listening from the shadows. This whole city was chaos. War was everywhere. People were running, carrying their lives in plastic bags. They had money, some of them, life savings, gold teeth, their wedding rings. He painted the picture with a stark, brutal clarity that made the hairs on Eleanor's neck stand up. And this man, the one with the car, he offered them a miracle, a new life, papers, a clean start in France, in Germany, in America. He had a reputation. A man who could make problems disappear. A man who could make people appear on paper where they were not. He was their only hope. Elena nodded slowly, her heart a heavy, painful drum in her chest. She had heard the offer herself, on the tapes. The smooth, reasonable voice promising a future, a clean slate, a miracle. Arthur was giving a face to the desperate, whispered voices she had heard from the old cassettes. They came here, Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the rusted, groaning door. By bus, by night, on foot. They were told to come here, to this warehouse, to bring everything they had. They were told it was a processing center, that inside, their new lives were waiting. His laugh was a dry, broken, bitter sound, devoid of all humor. Processing center, yes, it processed them. It took their past, their present, and their future. It took their money, it took their names, and it took their hope. It chewed them up and spit out nothing. He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes pleading with her to understand the enormity of it. People went in. Very few ever came out. Those who did were broken, empty. They had nothing left. They had paid the price for their new lives, but the new life never came. They were just processed. The simple, bureaucratic word had never sounded so sinister, so utterly evil. It was the sterile language of industrial-scale theft. Eleanor could feel Leo and Sophia behind her, drawn forward by the strange, intense conversation. Leo stood protectively near, his face a mask of grim fascination, absorbing every word. Sophia, too young to understand the specifics, but old enough to sense the profound gravity of the moment, clung to her mother's leg. Arthur's gaze softened for a bare second as he noticed the children, and a flicker of deep, profound sadness crossed his face. He looked back at Elena. "You have children," he stated, the simple observation filled with a world of meaning. "This is not a place for children. This is not a place for anyone with a soul left to lose. The poison of this place, it seeps into the ground. It seeps into you." He was not just warning her about the physical dangers. He was warning her about the spiritual corruption that radiated from the building. A stain that had soaked into the very concrete and refused to be washed away, even by 30 years of rain and neglect. His story was not just a general history, it became personal, his voice cracking with a grief that time had failed to dull. "I had a friend," he began, his voice dropping so low Elena had to strain to hear him. "His name was Ivan. We came from the same village, a village that no longer exists. He was a good man, a carpenter, strong hands. He had a wife and a small son, like yours." His eyes flickered to Leo. He had managed to save, not much, but everything. He sewed it into the lining of his coat, old coins, his wife's jewelry. He came here to meet the man with the smooth voice. He told me, "Arthur, I will go in. I will buy my boy a future. I will meet you tomorrow at the church, and we will be free men." He was so full of hope. His eyes, they were shining. Arthur choked on the memory, a dry sob catching in his throat. The smell of dust and desolation from the warehouse seemed to intensify, as if the building itself was remembering Ivan along with him. I waited. Artur whispered, his gaze turning inward, looking back across 3 decades of loss. I went to the church the next morning. I waited all day. The sun went down. He did not come. The simple words were devastating, a testament to a vigil of fading hope. I came back here. I watched this place for a week. I hid in the filth, and I watched. I saw others go in. I never saw Ivan come out. I never saw him again. He looked up, his eyes locking with Elena's, and in them she saw the raw, unhealed wound of his loss. The police. They did not care about one more missing refugee. He did not exist on their papers, so how could he be missing? He was just gone. Another ghost to haunt this cursed land. This place. It ate my friend. The finality in his voice was absolute. The ledgers were not just numbers. The tapes were not just voices. They were the story of Ivan, and hundreds like him, their final moments recorded and filed away, their value reduced to a stack of cash in a steel drawer. The puzzle was complete. Artur's story was the soul, the beating, bleeding heart of the cold, hard evidence locked away in the hidden room. Elena felt a surge of something new, something that burned through the fog of her fear, a white-hot, righteous fury. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, a desperate mother trying to survive. She was now a witness. She was the inheritor of Ivan's story, of all their stories. The money was not hers to take, and the secret was not hers to keep. It belonged to them, to the ghosts who whispered from the cassette tapes and whose stolen futures were itemized in the leather-bound ledgers. Her personal struggle for survival had become inextricably linked to a much larger fight for justice, a fight for the forgotten dead. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but now it was joined by a sense of profound, terrifying purpose. She had to do something. "He wants the land back," Eleanor said, her voice hard and clear. "He offered me 5,000 euros to leave." Artur let out another one of his dry, broken laughs. 5,000. "The price has gone down. For my friend Ivan, the price of a life was 20,000 Deutschmarks. This man, his greed is an ocean, but his wallet is small when it is his turn to pay. He knows you are here. He is not a man who leaves loose ends. He will not let you walk away now that you have disturbed his tomb." The old man's words confirmed her deepest fears. The 5,000 euro offer wasn't a negotiation. It was a test. And her hesitation had been a failed answer. Valerio wasn't coming back to talk. He was coming back to erase the problem, to erase her and her children, just as he had erased Ivan and all the others who had stood in his way or outlived their usefulness. The cold reality of her situation was a physical blow. As if summoned by their conversation, the night seemed to deepen abruptly. The last vestiges of twilight vanished, and a profound, inky blackness fell over the industrial wasteland. The constant, low hum of the power stations seemed to grow louder, more menacing in the sudden dark. Elena drew Sophia closer, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's head. "We have to leave," she whispered, more to herself than to Artur. But the old man shook his head, his face a grim mask in the gloom. "Leave and go where?" he asked. "His reach is long. He is a spider, and this whole city is his web. He knows you are here. If you run now, he will hunt you. You have seen his face. You are a loose end. Here at least we know the territory." The logic was terrifying but inescapable. Running blindly into the night would only make them more vulnerable. For now, the monster's lair was, paradoxically, the only place to hide from the monster. The air inside the warehouse grew heavy and cold as the night wore on. Eleanor used the last of her phone's battery to power a small, dim LED light, which cast long, dancing shadows that turned the piles of junk into lurking monsters. Sophia had finally cried herself to sleep, curled up on a bed of old coats, her face tear-stained even in slumber. Leo was too wired to rest. He sat near the hidden room's entrance, the steel rebar clutched in his hands like a makeshift sword, his young face set in a grim, determined expression. He was no longer a resentful teenager. He was a sentry, a boy forced into the role of a man by circumstances beyond his control. Elena's heart ached looking at him. Her failure had not just cost them their home, it had stolen her son's childhood. Every sound from outside made them both jump. Their nerves stretched to the breaking point. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow, agonizing drip of dread. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't the wind or the groaning metal. It was the distinct, unmistakable crunch of tires rolling slowly over gravel. Not the smooth purr of the Mercedes, but the heavier, grittier sound of a truck or a van. It stopped somewhere near the front of the warehouse. Eleanor immediately extinguished the light, plunging them into absolute darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she was sure it could be heard across the cavernous space. This was it. He was back. Or rather, he had sent his emissaries. A car door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the dead silence of the night. Then another. Heavy footsteps. 2 sets. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were announcing their arrival, a clear and brutal message of intimidation. The sound of their boots on the broken asphalt was a slow, deliberate death march, and it was coming straight for them. The rusted metal door, the one that had served as their only barrier to the outside world, was shoved open with a violent shriek of protest. 2 massive silhouettes filled the doorway, blocking the faint, distant glow from a street lamp miles away. They were mountains of men, their shapes distorted and made monstrous by the darkness. They didn't enter immediately, instead pausing in the opening, their presence a suffocating wave of pure menace that rolled into the warehouse. Elena could smell them from across the room, the foul, stale odor of cheap cigarettes, sweat, and something else, something metallic and cold that smelled like violence. One of them clicked on a powerful flashlight, and its beam cut a sharp, white path through the darkness, slicing through the dust motes and painting a stark, terrifying spotlight on the junk-filled interior. The beam swept across the space, a predator's eye searching for its cornered prey. The light found them. It landed on Eleanor and her children, huddled together near the back, and held them there, pinned like insects in its merciless glare. "Well, well, what do we have here?" A voice boomed, the words rough and gravelly. "A little family of rats nesting in the boss's property." The man who spoke stepped into the warehouse, followed closely by his silent partner. He was huge, with a shaved head that gleamed in the flashlight's beam and a thick neck that strained the collar of his leather jacket. The other man was leaner, but moved with a wiry, dangerous energy. They weren't here to negotiate. Their purpose was written in the cruel set of their mouths and the cold, dead light in their eyes. They were here to enforce Valerio's will. "The boss is a very generous man," the large man continued, his voice a mocking drawl. "But he made you a very generous offer. But you were greedy. Now, the offer has changed. You're going to leave with nothing." They advanced slowly, deliberately, their heavy boots crunching on the debris-strewn concrete floor. Each step was a hammer blow to Elena's already frayed nerves. She instinctively pushed Sophia behind her, shielding her with her own body. Leo stood his ground, raising the rebar in a pathetic but brave act of defiance. The larger thug laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Look at the little man, trying to protect his mommy. That's cute." He took another step, his shadow looming over them, a giant, terrifying eclipse. "Put the toy down, kid, before you get hurt. We're just here to deliver a message. You sign the paper, you walk away. You don't sign the paper." He left the threat unfinished, letting the silence and the darkness fill in the horrifying details. The other man silently produced a folded document from his pocket and a pen, holding it out. It was a transfer of ownership, Elena knew, a signature extracted by terror. The air was thick with the promise of violence. The men were close now, so close Elena could smell the cheap liquor on the big one's breath. His eyes, small and piggy, raked over her, then her children, with a look of utter contempt. He was enjoying their fear. This was his job, and he was good at it. The lean one's gaze was colder, more calculating, as he scanned the warehouse, his eyes lingering for a moment on the stacks of old crates and shelves. The message was clear. This was their last chance. Sign the paper and be cast out into the night. Destitute but alive, refuse, and the consequences would be severe. The threat wasn't just eviction, it was erasure. They would make them disappear. Another family of nobodies swallowed by the city, just like Ivan. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of panic. There was no way out. They were trapped, outnumbered, and utterly at the mercy of these monsters. The standoff stretched for a few agonizing seconds. The only sounds were Sophia's terrified, muffled whimpers and the heavy, asthmatic breathing of the larger thug. Then Leo moved. It wasn't a calculated action, but a raw, instinctive reaction born of fear and a desperate need to protect his family. He lunged forward, not at the men, but at the document in the leaner man's hand, trying to knock it away. It was a futile, foolish gesture. The lean man reacted with lightning speed, his hand shooting out and grabbing the front of Leo's shirt, twisting it, lifting the boy half off his feet. "You stupid kid," he snarled, his face contorting with rage. He drew his other hand back, his fist clenched, ready to strike. The sight of her son, helpless and about to be struck, shattered the paralysis of fear that had gripped Elena. A switch flipped in her brain. The terror did not vanish, but it was consumed by a tidal wave of pure, primal maternal rage. The world seemed to slow down. Elena was no longer Elena, the unemployed seamstress, Elena, the victim. She was a mother bear, and her cub was being threatened. Her eyes, frantic and wild, darted around the immediate area. She was no longer seeing piles of junk. She was seeing an arsenal. Her gaze locked onto the massive, unstable shelving unit right beside them. The one Leo had cleared crates from earlier, the one still precariously loaded with rusted engine blocks and heavy sheets of scrap metal. It was a disaster waiting to happen. It was her only weapon. It was their only chance. The thug's fist was already moving toward Leo's face. Time was gone. There was only action. She knew in that split second that what she was about to do would change everything. It was a point of no return, a leap into a chasm of chaos from which there would be no climbing back. The choice was made in the space of a frantic heartbeat. With a scream that was torn from the very depths of her soul, a sound of pure rage, fear, and desperation, she launched herself at the shelving unit. She didn't push it. She threw her entire body weight against its corner, using the momentum of her charge to unbalance it. For a terrifying fraction of a second, nothing happened. The massive structure groaned, a deep, resonant sound of stressed, rusting metal. The thugs turned toward the sound, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The lean one loosened his grip on Leo's shirt. Then, with the slow, inexorable finality of a falling giant, the entire unit began to topple. It swayed, shedding a shower of rust and dirt, and then came crashing down with a cataclysmic roar of tortured metal and smashing debris. The sound was an explosion, a rolling thunder that shook the concrete floor and filled the warehouse with a deafening, metallic scream. The chaos was absolute. The falling shelves struck the leaner man, a glancing blow on the shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a cry of pain. He fell hard, his flashlight flying from his hand, sending the beam spinning wildly across the ceiling before it smashed against the concrete and went out, plunging the scene into near-total darkness. The larger thug was luckier, jumping back just in time, but a cascade of heavy engine parts and sharp metal scraps rained down around him, pinning him in the corner, one of his legs trapped beneath a heavy, twisted steel beam. He roared in pain and fury, his voice muffled by the ringing in Elena's ears. The air was thick with a choking cloud of dust and rust, a red-brown fog that stung the eyes and throat. It was a perfect, terrifying, beautiful curtain of chaos. A single, precious moment of opportunity bought with violence and desperation. Elena didn't hesitate. Adrenaline surged through her veins, a powerful, clean fire that burned away all fear and left only a cold, sharp clarity of purpose. "Now!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the ringing in her own ears. She didn't have to think. Her mind had already mapped the path. While the thugs had been advancing, her subconscious had been planning the escape. She scrambled toward the hidden room, its doorway a rectangle of deeper blackness in the gloom. Her hands, guided by memory and desperation, found the desk. She didn't grab the money. The money was a curse, a weight they couldn't carry. She grabbed the evidence. Her fingers closed around the cold, stiff leather of the thickest ledger. Ivan's ledger, she thought wildly, and a handful of the plastic cassette tapes. It was heavy. It was real. It was the truth. She shoved them into the deep pocket of her coat. "Leo! Sophia! This way!" she yelled, her voice raw. She grabbed Sophia's small, trembling hand. Her daughter was crying, but it was a silent, terrified weeping. Leo was already there, his face pale in the gloom, but his eyes alive with a mixture of terror and awe at what his mother had just done. He understood. This was not a surrender. It was a counterattack. They didn't run for the main door, where the thug's vehicle was parked. That way was death. Instead, Elena pulled them toward the back wall of the warehouse to a spot they had discovered during their first miserable hours of exploration. A large panel of corrugated metal siding had rusted through at the bottom, creating a low, jagged opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. It led out to the back of the lot, to a field of weeds and a broken section of the perimeter fence. It was their secret exit. It was their only way out. They scrambled through the debris, their feet slipping on the grimy floor. Behind them, they could hear the enraged shouts of the trapped thug and the groans of the other as he tried to get to his feet. "Get them! Don't let them get away!" one of them bellowed, his voice filled with a murderous rage. The sounds of their fury were a spur, driving Elena and her children forward. Leo went through the hole first, wriggling on his stomach through the jagged opening, his clothes catching on the sharp, rusted edges. He turned and helped pull Sophia through. The little girl was sobbing openly now, her fear finally finding voice. Elena was last. She pushed the ledger and the tapes through the hole to Leo, then squeezed herself through the narrow gap, the cold, sharp metal scraping her back. For a single, heart-stopping moment, she thought she was stuck, but with a final, desperate heave, she was through. They were out. They were free, but they were running in pitch darkness, their lungs burning. The foul industrial air, a welcome relief from the choking dust of the warehouse. They stumbled through the field of high, dry weeds, the plants scratching at their legs. The sounds of the enraged thugs were still audible, but they were fading. Elena risked a single glance back. She could see the beam of a new flashlight, a weaker one, probably from a phone, dancing frantically inside the warehouse. They had seconds, maybe a minute, before the thugs found the hole or simply kicked their way through another part of the wall. They had to get away. She searched the darkness for a landmark, for any sign of hope, and then she saw it, a single, weak point of yellow light in the distance, a tiny, flickering beacon in the vast, oppressive darkness. It was the light from Arta's window. It was their destination. It was their last hope. They ran. They fled into the cold, unforgiving night, leaving the warehouse and its cursed treasure behind them. They were not running from their problems anymore. They were running towards a solution, however slim and dangerous it might be. Elena clutched the hard, rectangular shapes of the ledger and the tapes inside her coat. It was the only thing she had taken from that place. The only thing that mattered. It wasn't a fortune. It was something far more valuable and far more dangerous. It was the truth. The weight of it was immense, a heavy, tangible burden against her ribs. But it was also a shield. It was the story of Ivan and all the others. It was their justice. And as she ran, with her children at her side and the shouts of monsters fading behind them, she knew that she would not let their story die in the darkness. She would carry it into the light, or she would die trying. The flight into the night was not an end, but a beginning. The real battle had just begun. They burst into Arta's shack like ghosts fleeing a fire, gasping for breath, their clothes torn and smeared with rust and grime. The tiny space, lit by a single, bare yellow bulb, was a sanctuary of meager order. It smelled of wood smoke, old books, and hot tea, a stark, comforting contrast to the cold, metallic stench of the warehouse. Sophia was sobbing, a quiet, continuous stream of terror, while Leo stood panting, his face a pale mask of shock. Arta, seeing their state, his own fear was momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, protective resolve. "Inside, quickly," he rasped, bolting the flimsy door behind them. Elena collapsed onto a rickety wooden chair, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her hand, shaking, pulled the heavy ledger and the handful of cassettes from her coat. She laid them on the small, cluttered table. The objects seemed to hum with a dark energy in the quiet room. "This is it," she breathed, her voice a ragged whisper. "This is the proof. He sent men. They tried to... She couldn't finish. The weight of their survival, the hard edges of the tapes in her pocket, was the only thing that felt real. Arthur's gnarled fingers, stained with a lifetime of oil and dirt, traced the spidery handwriting in the ledger. A flicker of recognition, of profound and sorrowful understanding, passed across his ancient face. He didn't need to be told what it was. He had lived in the shadow of its creation for 30 years. "The Book of the Dead," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that felt as fresh as the night air. He looked up at Elena, his pale eyes holding a new, fragile spark, a glint of something other than fear. It was resolve. He shuffled to a corner of the shack, rummaging through a small wooden box filled with yellowed papers and forgotten trinkets. After a moment, he produced a small, tattered business card, its text faded but still legible. "This woman," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "She came here, maybe 20 years ago, asking questions no one wanted to answer, about the missing. A lawyer. She gave me this. She said if anyone ever had the courage to speak. I never called." He handed the card to Eleanor. The name on it was Isabelle Dubois, human rights attorney. It felt like a relic from a forgotten war, a fragile, almost impossible key to a door they had to unlock. The telephone was an ancient black rotary model, its plastic casing cracked with age. It sat on a small shelf, a direct line to a world Arta had long since disconnected from. The silence in the shack was absolute as Elena, her hand trembling so violently she could barely hold the receiver, dialed the number from the faded card. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a drum of doubt. It was after midnight. Who would answer? She half expected a deadline, a disconnected number lost to time. But it rang. Once, twice. Then a crisp, professional voicemail recording. Elena took a shuddering breath. The smell of old dust and ozone from the phone filling her nostrils. "My name is Elena," she began, her voice a strained whisper. "Arthur gave me your number. I am at the warehouse, the place they called the last stop. I have evidence, ledgers, tapes. From 1992, I have the story of a man named Ivan." She hung up, a wave of hopelessness washing over her. It was a message in a bottle thrown into a dark ocean. But less than a minute later, the phone shrieked. Its ring so loud and jarring it made them all jump. Elena snatched it up. "This is Isabelle Dubois," a sharp, intelligent voice said. "Don't move. Don't speak to anyone. I'm coming." Dawn had not yet broken when they arrived. There was no screech of tires or flash of sirens, just the silent, ghost-like appearance of two dark, unmarked sedans gliding to a stop outside Arta's shack. The figures who emerged moved with a quiet, professional competence that was the polar opposite of the thugs' brutish menace. These were not predators. They were instruments of a higher authority. Isabelle Dubois was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and an aura of controlled intensity. She was flanked by two grim-faced men in plain clothes who identified themselves as investigators from the Federal Prosecutor's Office for Organized Crime. Inside the shack's weak yellow light, Eleanor recounted the entire story, her voice shaking but clear. She placed the ledger on the table, its leather cover seeming to soak up the small room's light. She pushed the cheap cassette player forward and pressed play. The tinny, desperate voice of a refugee filled the silence, followed by Valerio's smooth, predatory tones. The investigators exchanged a single, grim look. They didn't need to hear more. They recognized the voice. They had an open, decades-old file on the monster of The Last Stop. The raid on Valerio's estate was a masterpiece of silent yet swift precision, executed as the sun rose over the city he believed he owned. Federal police, clad in black tactical gear, swarmed the manicured grounds of his mansion, a world of sculpted hedges and shimmering swimming pools that was light years away from the rust and rot of his warehouse. There was no negotiation, no polite knock. They breached the ornate front doors with a hydraulic ram, the sound of splintering mahogany echoing through the marble-floored foyer. They found him in his library, surrounded by priceless art and leather-bound first editions, sipping espresso in a silk dressing gown. The look on his face was not fear, but pure, unadulterated shock, the outrage of a king being deposed by commoners. the mask of the benevolent philanthropist so carefully maintained for 30 years, shattered into a million pieces. The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Valerio seemed to shrink, the aura of power evaporating, leaving only a withered, furious old man. The news crews, tipped off by the prosecutor's office, captured it all, broadcasting the fall of the Titan to a stunned and hungry public. While Valerio was being processed in a concrete holding cell that was a dark mirror of his hidden bunker, the warehouse was transformed. The jagged hole in the fence was sealed with official yellow tape that read, "Crime scene, do not cross." Forensic teams in white coveralls descended upon the ruin, their powerful floodlights banishing the shadows that had hidden so many secrets for so long. They found the hidden room almost immediately. The rest of the ledgers, the rest of the tapes, and the mountain of vacuum-sealed cash were all meticulously catalogued as evidence. The story became a national firestorm. News outlets dubbed the warehouse the philanthropist's tomb and the Vault of Tears. Artur, no longer a forgotten ghost on the edge of the city, became a key witness. He stood before cameras and prosecutors, his voice trembling but steady, and he told the world about Ivan. He gave a name, a face, and a heart to one of the countless victims, transforming them from a statistic in a ledger into a human being whose life had been stolen. After 30 years of silence, his testimony was a thunderclap of justice, a final damning indictment of the man in the silk dressing gown. The wheels of justice turned, slowly but inexorably. The mountain of Deutschmarks and francs, now evidence in one of the country's most significant organized crime trials, was seized by the state. For Elena, the terror began to recede, replaced by the gnawing uncertainty of her own future. She had done the right thing, but she and her children were still homeless, living in temporary accommodation provided by the prosecutor's office. Then, Isabelle Dubois called her in for a meeting. The lawyer explained a little-known but powerful provision in the federal code, the Citizens Asset Recovery Act. It was designed to reward individuals whose direct assistance led to the seizure of major criminal assets, because Elena had not only found the fortune, but provided the critical evidence and witness that unlocked the entire cold case. The state was legally obligated to award her a substantial portion of the money's officially converted value. The number Dubois quoted was so large, so impossibly vast, that Elena thought she had misheard. It wasn't a reward, it was a new universe. The crushing weight that had been on her shoulders for years simply evaporated. For the first time, she could breathe. The first thing she bought was not a luxury, but a certainty. It was a house. Not a sprawling mansion like Valerio's, but a modest, sun-filled home on a quiet, tree-lined street with a small garden out back. The day they moved in, the air smelled not of mold and rust, but of fresh paint and blooming jasmine. Elena walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing on the polished wood floors, a sound of promise, not desolation. She ran a hand along a smooth, clean wall, a stark contrast to the weeping concrete of the warehouse. There were no eviction notices here, no cold drafts snaking through broken windows. Sophia's new room was painted a brilliant, cheerful yellow, and she spent the first day simply spinning in circles in the middle of it, laughing. Leo, his face having lost the hard, angry edge it had carried for so long, found a quiet corner by a large window and began to unpack his books. He was a boy again. Elena watched them, a feeling of profound, overwhelming peace settling over her. This wasn't just a house. It was a recovery. It was a home, built not on a desperate gamble, but on courage. This was a place to heal. The broken sewing machine that had once symbolized her utter destitution was ceremoniously retired to a place of honor on a shelf. In its place, in a bright, airy room she converted into a studio, sat a new, state-of-the-art machine. The familiar hum and whir that filled her new home was no longer the sound of desperate survival, but the joyful, creative music of her reclaimed passion. Soon, her tailoring business, Elena's Stitches, was thriving, known for its meticulous quality. But her purpose ran deeper than fabric and thread. With a significant portion of her newfound wealth, and with the guidance of Isabelle Dubois, she established a charitable foundation. She called it the Last Stop Foundation. Its mission was simple and clear: to provide free legal aid, translation services, and emergency housing for refugee and immigrant families navigating the bewildering bureaucracy of a new country. She had transformed the source of her fortune, a fortune built on the exploitation of the vulnerable, into a powerful engine of justice and support for those same people. The cursed money had been redeemed, its dark history laundered not by criminals, but by compassion. One crisp autumn evening, a year after they had fled the warehouse, the air in Elena's home was warm and filled with the rich, savory smell of roasted chicken and garlic. The light from the dining room cast a golden glow on her children's faces. Sophia, chattering excitedly about her day at school, was missing a front tooth. Leo, his eyes clear and focused, was arguing passionately about a book he was reading. They were happy. They were safe. Elena watched them, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She remembered the taste of ash in her mouth from lying to Sophia about being hungry, the agonizing knot in her stomach as she counted her last few coins. Now, the table before them was a testament to their new reality, a bounty earned not by greed, but by a refusal to let the darkness win. Elena's story is a powerful reminder that even in the deepest despair, courage can unearth justice, and one person's stand can give voice to countless forgotten ghosts. To ensure you don't miss more incredible stories of resilience, hope, and redemption, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.